Yesterday, the world didn't just break, it revealed how broken we've already become. It's not just the weight of the 3 tragedies in 24 hours, it's the terrifying realization that our capacity to feel them is disappearing.
We woke up to news that made it feel like the world had cracked, that every warning sign we've been following finally erupted at once. It's a kind of exhaustion that doesn't fade because it's not just about the events themselves. It's about everything underneath them.
Today isn't about reliving every detail of 3 awful attacks. It's about what they reveal when you put them next to the political response to Rob Reiner's passing, and what happens to all of us when cruelty becomes a political brand.
And we need to be very clear about what we mean by brand. We aren't talking about a leader having a bad day or a slip of the tongue. We're talking about a deliberate strategy where nastiness is used as currency.
Exactly. It's a style of politics where the goal isn't to debate policy, it's to humiliate, to shock, to signal to your base that you are willing to break every norm of decency just to own the other side. It frames empathy as a liability and brutality as a strength.
And the scary part is that it works. It dominates the news cycle, it gets engagement, but when you turn performative cruelty into a winning strategy, you don't just change the tone of Washington, you change the instinct of the entire world. You tell millions of people that the loudest, cruelest voice in the room is the one that deserves to be followed.
There was the tragedy at Bondi Beach, a Hanukkah celebration shattered in moments. A night that should have been filled with candles and music and families was suddenly turned into chaos. 15 people lost their lives, dozens injured, a community broken in a way that will stay with them forever.
And while Australia was grieving, the United States was hit with another tragedy at Brown University. Yet another American campus thrown into lockdown. Another night of sirens, another group of students who will never forget hiding in the dark, waiting for the all clear, while texting their parents to say, "I love you."
But it was the third blow that made the world feel smaller, colder, and just broken. Because the violence alone, as devastating as it is, wasn't what made yesterday feel different. It was the realization that our response to tragedy isn't shaped by grief anymore. It's shaped by something colder, something learned, something we've absorbed over years without even noticing.
You can feel it in the way people talk about these events now, the speed at which compassion disappears, the way shock turns into argument, the way human beings become symbols before anyone even learns their names. It's like we've crossed into a place where empathy has to fight for space, and most days it loses.
And once you realize how quickly empathy gets pushed aside, you start to understand why the passing of Rob Reiner and his wife didn't just land as a personal tragedy. It landed like a mirror being held up to the world we're living in. Because Reiner understood exactly how dangerous public cruelty had become.
He warned about it for years. He called it out even when people threatened him. And even when a man who mocked victims of violence and joked that Paul Pelosi's attacker should be bailed out lost his own life, Reiner responded with empathy. He didn't celebrate, he didn't weaponize the moment, he behaved like a human being.
But the reaction to Reiner's death showed how far we've drifted from that kind of decency.
And in the end, the reaction from the top proved him right in the most heartbreaking way. No compassion, no pause, no reflection, just cruelty. Instead of offering condolences, Trump posted a message that treated a man's life as nothing more than a cheap political score.
He mocked Reiner as tortured. He claimed his death was caused by anger and obsession. He diagnosed a grieving family with a fake political disease. He used the death of a husband and wife to settle a score and make it about himself. And the part that should shake people the most is this. Trump posted that message before the full details were even known.
He assumed he knew the narrative, and he still framed the death as something deserved. It tells us exactly how he will respond if political unrest grows in America. He will mock the victims, he will validate the anger, and he will justify the cruelty.
This is Trump's brand in action. He knows that empathy doesn't trend. He knows that decency doesn't dominate the news cycle. So he chooses the shock. He chooses the insult. He keeps the machine fed even if it means dancing on a grave.
And this isn't new behavior. This is who he has always been. We've seen it over and over, mocking a disabled reporter, making jokes about the attack on Paul Pelosi, insulting John McCain's service, and he even said he preferred people who weren't captured when confronted with the fact that McCain was a war hero.
Each time the bar dropped a little bit lower, and every time the bar drops, the world changes. Because he doesn't just express cruelty, he normalizes it. He made it acceptable for millions of people to talk this way, to behave this way. And once a leader with that much power gives people permission to abandon basic decency, the effects don't stay contained, they spread.
It gives people permission to numb themselves, to treat cruelty as entertainment, to see tragedy as ammunition, and to see empathy as weakness.
And once you've absorbed something like that, a leader responding to death with mockery, it colors everything that happened yesterday. It changes the way the world feels.
Bondi Beach is one of those places people picture when they think of calm and beauty. But on the first night of Hanukkah, it became a scene of absolute fear. 2 attackers targeted a gathering meant to celebrate resilience, faith, and community. The aftermath left 15 people dead and nearly 40 treated in hospitals.
One of the victims was a 10-year-old girl named Matilda. Another was a Holocaust survivor, Tibor Weitzen, 87 years old, who died trying to shield a friend from the bullets. A rabbi, a retired officer, a volunteer, people whose lives were taken simply for being there.
But alongside that sorrow and solidarity, social media filled with debate and deflection, arguing about policy, leadership, who to blame, national identity, and divisions that have nothing to do with the pain of the families who lost their loved ones. Some focus less on grief and more on who to fault, who to criticize, or how to fit their agenda.
And that shows you where we are now. Even in the face of an attack during a celebration of light and hope, we struggle to mourn first. We struggle to feel before we argue.
That's the world we're living in now, a world where the reaction to tragedy is almost more frightening than the tragedy itself. A world where people rush to score points instead of showing compassion. A world where the loudest voices encourage division because it benefits them politically.
And that's the direct result of the political brand we're talking about. When some leaders treat every crisis as an opportunity to score points, the public starts doing the same. We stop seeing a tragedy and we see a debate topic.
And yet, even in that chaos, someone stepped in. His name is Ahmed al-Ahmed, a Syrian Muslim, a father of 2, and a grocer. He saw the panic and saw the wounded children and saw people running for their lives. And he didn't run the other way. He charged towards the danger. He disarmed the gunman. And he was injured in the process, but he survived.
His father said he acted on conscience, on humanity, on instinct. And that moment, a Muslim man risking his life to save Jewish families during an anti-Semitic attack should have been the headline everywhere. But the world is so overwhelmed by noise that even acts of courage get buried.
And that's why these events feel so much heavier today. Because we're forced to look at 2 sides of what humanity is capable of. On one side, courage, compassion, sacrifice. On the other, hate, division, cruelty from leaders who should know better but don't care.
And while Australia was trying to understand what happened at Bondi, the United States was living through another nightmare of its own. Another campus tragedy, this time at Brown University. Another night of students behind locked doors wondering if they'd ever go home again. And what hit me wasn't just the violence. It was how quickly the country seemed to absorb it, like it barely had time to register before the conversation moved on to something else.
That's the part that scares me every time. These events in America have become so frequent that people talk about them the way they talk about bad weather. If it's fewer than a handful of victims, it doesn't even break through the headlines anymore. Imagine reaching a point where sirens on a university campus feel routine. Imagine being so used to trauma that it takes something catastrophic just to make people look up.
And that's where we are. Because the United States doesn't just have a violence problem, it has a hate problem. A deep, relentless, untreated hate problem. And once you see it, you understand why nothing changes. Because it's not just about the weapons. It's about the culture that wraps itself around them. The politics built on fear, the rhetoric built on anger. It's a whole ecosystem that rewards the worst instincts in people.
And that kind of hate doesn't stop at the border. It doesn't matter that Canada has different laws or that Australia took action decades ago. Hate moves through culture. It moves through language. It moves through the way powerful people talk about each other and what they make acceptable.
And if something as horrific as Bondi Beach can happen in Australia, a country that has some of the strictest gun laws in the world, a country that isn't drowning in firearms the way the US is, then we have to be honest with ourselves. It can happen here, too. Because nobody is immune to the world people like Trump and Musk are shaping. Hate travels. Division travels. All he needs is a spark and permission to spread.
So the question becomes, what do we do with that? Because we can't be helpless bystanders in someone else's chaos. We need to decide what kind of country we want to be. We get to build something different here, something stronger, something that doesn't rely on cruelty to feel powerful.
For us, that starts with choosing leaders that don't treat cruelty as entertainment. It starts with protecting communities before tragedy shows up at their door. It starts with calling out the hate as soon as we see it, even the quiet, muttered kind that people shrug off. It means refusing to let lies go unchallenged, and it means being loud about empathy in a world that rewards the opposite.
And that's where we can look at our own country, because while we worry about American-style politics bleeding into Canada, yesterday proved that we haven't fully succumbed to it yet.
Look at the leadership we saw. Mark Carney, as Prime Minister, responded with the kind of grace you'd expect. Calm, focused on the victims, dignified. He reminded us that light prevails.
But even more telling was the response from the other side. Pierre Poilievre is often called Maple Mega. He's known for being an attack dog. He's often divisive. But yesterday, he didn't use the tragedy to rage farm. He didn't use it to attack his opponents.
And that matters. If our most right-wing leader, the one people fear will take us down that dark path, can still pause and show decency in a moment like this, then it proves something important. It proves that we aren't that far gone yet. There is still hope.
Because if cruelty can spread like a virus, then so can decency, so can courage, so can the instinct to look out for each other instead of tearing each other apart. We get to choose which grows here. Canada doesn't have to follow that path. Not if we decide together that we're done normalizing hate, that we're done shrugging off cruelty as just politics, that we're ready to build a country where empathy isn't the weakest voice in the room, it's the loudest.
So we're not ending today with answers. We're not trying to wrap this up neatly. There's nothing neat about the events of this weekend. Nothing simple, nothing that can be spun into optimism.
All we can do is say it clearly. 3 tragedies, 2 countries on opposite sides of the world, 1 terrible day, and a world that's spiraling because cruelty has been allowed to lead.
And if we want anything to change, we have to stop normalizing this. We have to stop letting days like this roll past us as if they're routine, because they're not, and they never ever should be.
So today, maybe the best thing we can do is something small. Give the people we love an extra hug, share a kindness with a stranger, remind someone they matter, because if cruelty can spread in the way we've seen, then kindness can too. If we choose it, deliberately, stubbornly, and every chance we get.
Thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.